Well, thank you so much first for this invitation and for the introduction, Margareta. I mean, I really like this seminar, this kind of initiative. You know, I hate online conferences, but this is not an online conference, right? It's an online seminar where you can join from anywhere in the world. I think it's a great idea, and we need more of this. So it's cool to be part of this. So I'm going to talk about my work today. So as Margareta just said, I'm specialized in infant cognition, and basically the overarching goal of my research is to try to understand how infants think and how their thinking might differ in some way or not from the way adults think. So this means basically that we need ultimately to do three things: to characterize what kind of thoughts infants can have, what kind of thoughts adults can have, and if the two differ in some way, what's the process that can explain this change. And what I want to stress is that, of course, the third step is really the third step, right? So there's before we can really ask about what kind of process can explain the transition between the two states, we really need to understand what the problem is. So we really need to try to characterize what kind of thoughts infants have. Because of course, if infants have the same type of thought that adults have, then it's just a mapping problem. But if they have a different type of thoughts, then it becomes a more maybe complicated, but also maybe more interesting issue, which is to try to understand what kind of force can trigger some representational and conceptual changes. So what do we know about the format of mental representations in infancy? I think very, very briefly, we can say that, of course, young infants have perception, and they have perceptual-like representations that could account for things such as habituation, recognition of an object. That can explain also some type of categorization, like perceptual categorization, and also some mental operations such as mental rotation. But we know also that infants have what we call core cognition, and core cognition is kind of a in-between system. The idea is that it has, well, it is thought to have, just like perception, some kind of a analog or iconic format of representation, but it also involves contents that are not perceptual, such as the solidity and continuity principles of objects, such as goal representations, and maybe belief representations. What I want to argue is that this type of representations, because they are perceptual-like, because they're iconic in some way, analog in some way, they are well suited to represent entities and properties of objects, but they are less well suited to represent abstract relations. And this comes from simply the definition of abstraction, abstractness, that is the quality of being considered apart from a specific instance or a specific object, right? So from the moment you need to represent something that is really abstract, then it becomes hard to imagine how it can be represented really in perception. So that suggests that infants might, well, that raises the question, how do you represent abstract relation? And of course, there's another type of mental representations that we know adults have because they can use this in language, which we might call propositional representations. And representations are very easy to represent in relations, so they are easy to represent in propositional representations because they are represented simply by discrete symbols. So the idea is that in propositional representation, what you have are things like A, R, B, where you have a symbol for two entities, A and B, but you also have a symbol for R, that is the relation between A and B. And what is happening here is that you have really a discrete symbol. I think discrete really is the important word, because by being discrete, it's really separated, it's really dissociated from the representation of the two entities. And that way, it really achieves full abstraction. So what I'm going to focus in this talk is I'm going to focus on the abstract relation same and different as a case study to investigate the format of representation of infants' thoughts. And I want to take this opportunity to advertise a special issue that we published earlier this year that is co-edited by myself with Ed Wasserman and Susan Carey, that focuses on same different conceptualization from many different point of views. There are a lot of animal studies, a few infant and developmental studies, also some computational studies. So if you want to go deeper on same and different, that can be a nice way to start. All right, so when you have so there is a huge literature on same and different in animal species, right? And when you look at the literature very quickly and not going too deep, you might think that it's an easy problem and that all species basically have a representation of same and different, right? Pigeons, chimps, bees, ducklings, babies. So it seems that any species that's been looked at have some kind of representation of same and different. But what I want to stress is that behind the homogeneity, the apparent homogeneity of these results, there is a lot of heterogeneity in the paradigms that have been used to achieve these conclusions. And very broadly, you have in fact 3 types of paradigms that have been used. And some are really, you find really success with any species, right? So the match to sample, for instance, non-match to sample seem to be achievable by bees, pigeons, crows, mice, etc. Also, what we can call the same different discrimination task, where the participants have to respond one way to same, another way to different. Sometimes the other way may be just not responding at all. And also this seems to be fairly easy for many species. But there's one type of a paradigm that seems to be much more difficult. It's the relational match to sample. And to sum up really the literature, basically the only species that seems to be succeed easily and reliably are human adults. There are a few results and some really challenging results with crows and parrots recently that suggests that maybe also animal species can do it, but those are really outliers in this literature. So let's consider for now at least that there seems to be some kind of discontinuity in evolution here, where we see that there's one species that seems to be better, at least at this task, the relational match to sample. So whether I will, so in this talk, I will have 3 main points. The first is to argue that just like there is discontinuity in phylogeny, there is also discontinuity along the ontogeny with respect to the ability to represent abstract relations. Then I will ask whether same and different are also represented in infancy. And the answer is yes. So the final point would be to ask what kind of format these representations may have. So for each of these points, what I propose is that you can stop me. Maybe we can stop at the end of each of these parts and have a small discussion if you are willing to comment on this, if you have questions. Also, if there are things that are just completely not understandable, well, don't hesitate to ask for clarification at any point. Okay, so the relational match to sample. So what's this task? I guess in this group, probably you're all very familiar, but anyway, the idea is that participants have to match pairs based on the relation within each pair, right? So you have to match AA to CC. Why? Because both AA and CC are exemplars of the relation same. And you have to match AB to DE. Why? Because both AB and DE are exemplars of the relation different. And so this task was introduced by David Primack in his work with Sarah, with the chimp Sarah. And he also, in his 83 paper in BBS, he reports that some work with children, right? So what he writes that children below 4 years of age fail on the relational match to sample, and that they start to succeed first with matching same to same, and later also at 6 years of age, matching different to different. And in that paper, he refers to Primack and Macro in preparation. And unfortunately, that paper is still in preparation as of today. So when we realized that, we were really surprised to realize that there was no relational match to sample in the literature with children matching same to same and different to different, right? So we decided to take up this task. And this is the way we did this. So we introduced these two puppets, okay, doggy and panda. And we had cards. Each of these cards has two symbols on it. And basically the idea is that these two puppets like certain type of cards. And we show one card that doggy might like, okay, this one. And now we ask, okay, if doggy likes this card, which of these two cards do you think doggy will also like? If panda likes this card, which of these two cards do you think panda will also like? So the idea is that, of course, the rule is that doggy likes the different cards and panda likes the same cards. So if children learn the rule, they might at some point respond correctly, and they were getting stickers for every correct answer. The reason we did the task this way is that we wanted to avoid any word. Well, now we thought it would be easy. Right? We thought that would be an easy task, and we wanted to avoid any word that that could be same, different, or match, or any word that would refer to something like the relation same. And these are the results. So it wasn't easy. 3-year-olds fail completely. 4-year-olds fail. 5-year-olds succeed, but they're still not that great. And 6-year-olds succeed. Okay. And so the observation here is that 3-year-olds fail, just like monkeys and pigeons and other animals in the literature. But in the literature, well, sorry, first, then we replicate this result in maybe what can be considered a simpler way by removing the puppets. And now we show one card and we show two cards and we say, which of these two cards do you think goes with this one? Okay, so again, you have to choose the correct card based on the relation within the card. So same goes with same and different goes with different. And again, we replicate the finding, that is that 5-year-olds succeed, but 4-year-olds are a chance. Now, in the literature, you know that Ed Wasserman has done a huge amount of work showing that if instead of using pairs, you used larger arrays of pictures, for instance, arrays of 16 pictures, then animals become better. And now, for instance, baboons and pigeons can pass the relational match to sample by matching 16 same to 16 same and 16 different to 16 different. Okay, so we wanted to see whether children also do the same. And we tested 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds, and you can see that now both 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds pass the task. So it seems that, again, 3-year-olds are behaving like the monkeys and pigeons in these tasks. Now, in the literature, you also know that what Wasserman and colleagues have shown is that the behavior of animals, of pigeons especially, and baboons, can be modeled by what he calls entropy. That is a computation of the internal variability of the array. Okay, so one point I want to mention is that for me, entropy is not really the same thing as a relation, same and different. Why? Because entropy is not a relation. Entropy is a property of an array. Right, so it's the property of an array of 16 items, but it's not a relation between the arrays. But so now the task is, so the training is the same as before, right? So participants are trained to match 16 same to 16 same, 16 different to 16 different. But then in the test, they see samples that have intermediate entropy. So 16 same have an entropy of 0 because everything is the same. 16 different has an entropy of 4. Now, what happens if you present entropy, so a mixed array of same and different pictures? So for instance, 4 different and 12 same, which corresponds to an entropy of 1.3, or 8 different and 8 same, that's an entropy of 2.5, 12 different and 4 same. And so this is this is the data from Fago, Wasserman, and Young in 2001, where they tested 2 baboons on the top here and 2 humans. And what you can see here is that the proportion of choosing all different is almost, so for one baboon linear, for the other one maybe it's more like a logarithmic relation with entropy. Whereas what you can see is that human adults have a much more categorical behavior. So those are only two humans. We tested with a very similar task 100 participants, and this is what we got. Basically, we have two types of behaviors. One that we can label, that seems to correspond to very categorical strategy, that is all the same versus not all the same, right? So what do participants do here when they see a sample that is 16 same icon, they match it to 16 same icons. But as soon as there are some different icons, they choose the 16 different icon. Okay, so this is a rule in terms of all the same versus not all the same. And but the most frequent strategy that participants use is this one, where they choose 16 same for 16 same samples, but also for 4 different and 12 same icons. That is, those that have more same icons than different. And for the rest, they choose all different. Right? So what we think is happening here is that participants are really following the rules that we taught them. That is, we taught them to match all same to all same and all different to all different. Now, when we present cards that are intermediary, they don't match any, they're not really all same or all different, right? So participants seem to choose according to which is more similar. So to which has more same or more different, right? So this corresponds, I think, to a rule such as all the same versus all different. Okay, so those are adults. Now the question is, what are children doing? So here we tested 3- and 4-year-old children. And again, we divided participants, where we tried to classify participants according to the strategy they used. And what we found is that, the 3-year-olds are almost all here on the right, where you can see that they show a linear increase with entropy of their choice of all different. So that's a strategy that seems to rely on entropy. And half of the 4-year-olds are still there, but the other half of 4-year-olds are representing a rule that is either all the same, not all the same, or all different, all the same versus all different. Right? So the important point here is that almost all, all but two of the 3-year-olds behave like baboon and chimps, and half of the 4-year-olds begin to behave differently, that is like adult participants in this task. Okay. So there seems to be that something is changing around 4 years of age, or between 3 and 4 years of age. And that's interesting, because there is something else that changes between 3 and 4 years of age, and that relates to same and different, and it's the acquisition of the words. So here we tested children understanding of the words same and different in a very simple way. We showed our cards either with pairs or actually also with 16 arrays. And we ask children, can you show me the card where pictures are the same? Or can you show me the card where pictures are different? And what you can see here is that whereas 2-year-olds don't understand any of the 2 words, 4-year-olds understand both words, and 3-year-olds, of course, are in between. An interesting finding here as well is that 3-year-olds really understand either both words or neither, right? We don't really have children well, we have very few children at least that demonstrate the understanding of only one of the 2 words. And I think that's an interesting point. We might come back to this later if you want to. But here, the important point is that 4-year-olds understand the words same and different, 2-year-olds don't, and 3-year-olds are, of course, in between. So that suggests that maybe the success in the relational match to sample that starts to emerge at 4 years might be related to mastering the word. And we have another piece of evidence for that, which is that in all of these tasks, we ask participants at the very end if they could justify their choice. And we coded this justification depending on whether they used the word same and different, or whether they did not. And so what we did here is to separate on the left, those are looking only at those participants that use the words same and different. And you can see that those participants are just at sitting in every of our tasks. Whereas if you look at participants on the other side, there are chance everywhere except in one condition, and that's the condition where they could use entropy. So that's the result I showed you where 3-year-olds and some of the 4-year-olds seem to show entropy. So it really seems that those children who succeed in this task are those that use the words same and different. Okay, so what I want to claim here is that there is this discontinuity along ontogeny with respect to the ability of representing some abstract relations that is same and different. And around 4 years of age, we saw that children have acquired the word same and different, and now they begin to succeed at the relational match to sample. And they also seem to be able to spontaneously represent rules that are predicated on something like all the same. So are there questions about this so far? Do you want to discuss this? How do I see the questions?
Holyoke has a question. So Professor Holyoke, when you're ready, you can ask your question.
Yeah, hi Jean-Rémy. Very interesting talk so far. I guess I just wonder what your thoughts are about the causal relationship between the acquisition of the word same and different and the reasoning performance. Because on the face of it, it could sort of go either way, right? You would imagine that if you can start to conceptualize same and different, it'll become easier to learn the appropriate linguistic labels for those things. But of course, you could also imagine that knowing the linguistic labels already would prepare you to acquire the concepts more effectively. And is there any way to tease these apart? Because same and different, of course, can be applied to what amounts to like the original match to sample. It doesn't have to be relational. So you could imagine that you could start to understand same and different based on simpler tasks. Maybe that's an argument for why that would be good preparation to move on to the more relational same and different. But anyhow, just wondering if you thought more about how to tease those things apart.
So you're absolutely right that so far it could go both ways, and I will come back to that at the very end. But I don't want to spoil the conclusion. But in any case, there's nothing to spoil because the truth is I don't have a definite argument to support one way or the other. But my tendency is to think that the causal relation goes in the direction that the words help having the representations that are necessary for the relational match to sample. And well, one piece of evidence for that maybe is that we see children, so we don't see any children succeeding in the relational match to sample without already knowing the word same and different, at least so far with the data that we have. I'm not saying it's completely impossible, but this is what we have at this point. That being said, it's also true that we see a lot of children that know the word same and different and don't succeed on the relational match to sample, right? So what I just argue is that all of the 4-year-olds understand the word same and different, but we had only 50% or even less of children passing the relational match to sample. So there are clearly children that know the words and fail the relational match to sample, but we don't see children who don't know the words and pass the relational match to sample. So that would be, I think, a piece of evidence that suggests that maybe it's first the word and then the relational match to sample, but I think it should be studied. I mean, I still plan on studying that more in details. I see Deidre wants to say something about that, maybe, or about something else. I'm sorry, I don't hear you.
Good. Okay. Hi. Beautiful talk. I think the Hochmann et al. 217 talk paper is just a model of clarity. And you absolutely nailed that these entropy responses are not relational, and you get a completely different pattern between array matches and relational matches. I would, however, just like to say a quick thing about language. As you probably know, we believe that learning language actually encourages children to try to figure out what the words mean and can actually accelerate the learning of relational terms, which are hard to learn. And one piece of evidence for that is that when Christy and I use the word trifid, this is a trifid, which one of these is a trifid, during the relational match to sample task, 3-year-olds, which, as you point out, normally fail, were able to succeed in exactly the same 8 trials with no trainings. So I think the words may not just be reflections, but also inducements to compare things and see something that they didn't see before. I'll leave it at that so you can go on with your talk.
Absolutely. No, yeah. So I mean, I agree. And that's yeah, you're right. That's another piece of evidence that goes this way. There's another piece of evidence that I forgot about, which is Premack's original study, right?
Yes.
That was the whole point of Premack with the relational match to sample, was to show that Sarah, who had learned a symbol, an external symbol in her case, for same and for different, she could pass the relational match to sample, whereas naive chimps could not, and there are additional work by Odden and Thompson that go in the same direction. So yeah, so those are all pieces of evidence, I think, that suggest that it's really the words first and the representation second, but still, I think it's worth looking at this more closely. Okay, so I want to argue that there's this discontinuity, say around 3-4 years of age. But of course, so what, the typical question when you talk about discontinuity of mental representation in development is, what would Fodor say, right? So Fodor famously argued that you cannot learn any new concept with hypothesis testing, at least. And I like to put this this argument in relation to the French chemist Lavoisier, who famously argued that nothing is created, nothing is lost, it's only transformation, right? And so, and the idea that I'm going to push is kind of similar here in the case of same and different. That is, the idea is that if you have new representation as 3 or 4 year olds, they cannot be created ex nihilo. They have to be created on the basis of some precursor. So those precursors can be the full thing, and maybe, well, I mean, the question is, or even learning the word. So you cannot learn the word same and different based on nothing. They have to be based either on some pre-existing concept or on some precursor representation. And in that case, we need to qualify those precursors and explain how they might differ from the mature representation. So do we have evidence that same and different are represented in infancy? And the answer, of course, is yes. I'm going to focus here on my work, but of course, there is a lot of other work with habituation studies from Gerdner's group, and with the Blickett detector task from Walker and Gopnik and collaborators. And other studies maybe that I'm forgetting. But so, do infants have same and different? And for this, we used this same different discrimination task. Okay, so you remember in the animal literature, that's basically when you teach participants to respond one way for same and the other way for different. And in our case, we're going to teach infants to look on the right for same and on the left for different, or the opposite. So how do we do this? So we had infants sitting in front of an eye tracker. And on the screen, you can see that there were these 2 windows. And in these windows, you have puppets that can appear. And what will happen is that when infants look at this blinking cross in the center, there are 2 geometrical shapes that are going to appear. If those 2 shapes are identical, then the puppet will appear on the left. If they are different, then the puppet will appear on the right. And we're going to repeat this, I think, 24 times in the original study, varying the shapes and the colors of the elements. Crucially, the same shape and color can appear in same pairs and in different pairs. Okay, so what really matters is not that it's a green triangle or that it's a blue disk. What matters is the relation between the 2 elements. So same predicts here left and different predicts right. So initially infants should have no reason to expect the puppet to appear left and right, left or right, sorry. But as we show more and more evidence, they might discover the rule if they have the representation same and different, and might start to anticipate or to look on one side or the other. And we added a test trial where we test for generalization. So here we're going to show novel pairs with novel shapes, novel colors. And at this point, there is no puppet appearing either left or right. And we want to see whether infants are going to search on one side or on the other. So the results I'm going, so then we can measure the first fixation, so whether they first look one side or the other, but also how long they look one side or the other. And the results are perfectly congruent. And the results are these, that when, so for novel pairs of same pairs, they search on the correct side. So they learn the rule, they learn that same predict left, but for different, there were a chance here. And so that was with 7 months old. With 12 months old, we did something slightly more complicated. That is that the color always changes, but it's the shape that matters here. So if it's same shape, the puppet appears on the left. If it's different shape, the puppet appears on the right. And again, we test for generalization. And again, we find the same result. That is that 12 months old could learn the rule, same shape, predict left, but there were a chance for different. We also did the same type of experiments in another modality, this time using syllables. So now when infants look at the center, the central fixation will disappear, but they will hear 2 syllables. And if the 2 syllables are identical, say da, da, or lo, lo, then the puppet will appear on the right. If the 2 syllables are different, da, lo, or lo, fu, then the puppet will appear on the left. Okay. So again, it's not the identity of the syllable that predicts where the puppet is going to appear, but it's really the relation between the 2 syllables. If they're the same, the puppet appears on one side. If they're different, it appears on the other side. And again, we test for generalization with novel syllables, novel consonants, and novel vowels. And again, we find that infants could learn the rule predicated on same, but there were a chance for different. We also did the same experiment, but this time it's only the vowel that repeats. Okay, so da, la, and lu, fu, fodo, etc. predicts that the puppet comes right. And when both consonant and vowels are different, the puppet appears on the left. And again, we found that infants could learn the rule predicated on same, so same vowel predicts right, but there were a chance for different. Okay. So these experiments, together, as I said before, with habituation studies and some other type of same different discrimination studies, suggest that infants do have a representation of same. However, you might have noticed that in all of these experiments, we failed to demonstrate any representation of different in young infants. So what about different? I think, and that's a point I made earlier, that in the infant literature, all results, or almost all of the results, can be explained by rules that are about same and not necessarily about different, even when we try to teach a rule about difference. So for instance, in the non-matched sample, right? So where we present a sample and then say the blue cross and the choices between the orange rectangle and the blue cross, and the correct response is the orange rectangle because that's the one that is different. What participants might be doing is just to avoid the element that is the same. Same thing in Bliket detector task, for instance, by Walker and Gopnik, where the correct choice are the 2 blocks that are different. Well, what participants might be, when they have to choose 2 blocks that are different, that's contrasted with 2 blocks that are the same. So again, when they choose different, what they might be doing is really not choosing, that is avoiding what's the same. Okay. So what I want to argue is that all of these results could really reflect, again, a representation of same, but not necessarily a representation of different. And why is that so? Well, what would that suggest? At least what our experiment suggests is that same is more salient and maybe easier to represent than different. So if you are an infant and you have the chance to represent a rule, a situation based on the relation same, you're going to do it because it's going to be easier, simpler than if you have to use different. And in fact, this asymmetry between the representation of same and different is not present only in infants, but even in childhood and in adulthood. We could see in the relational match to sample task, so in the array match to sample task, so the one with 16 icons, we could see that participants spontaneously learn rules that were something like all the same versus not all the same, right? So if you remember when we tested 100 adults, we had 30% who were spontaneously generating that rule, all the same versus not all the same. We had none that generated spontaneously the opposite rule, all different versus not all different. So that alone suggests that there's really an asymmetry in this representation, and that same is really primitive, is really more salient than different. Okay, anyhow, I do want to argue that there is a representation of different in infancy, even though it might be more complex than the representation of same, and therefore might be more difficult to identify. And this is the way we could show this, I think, by using a pupillometry paradigm. So it's really an oddball paradigm. So what we do, we're going to use syllables here. So infants are again in front of the eye tracker. There is a central fixation cross here. And when infants look here, there's this little guy that appears on the screen and that starts jumping like that. That really has no importance except that it attracts infants' attention towards the screen, and that's what we need to be able to measure their pupil. But what's important is that anytime they see this guy, they're going to hear a sequence of syllables. And there were in this experiment 4 types of sequences. 3 of them are a sequence of identical syllable, but ending with a different syllable. Okay, so the number of syllables varies, but that's the structure. Number of same syllable, and the last one is different. So they hear something like pu, 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 ke, or mi, 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 ra, or lu, lu, fa. And then in 25% of the trials, they hear sequences that violate the structure of the other sequences by missing this final different syllable. So they hear something like te, 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 te. Okay. So the idea is that if infants realize that most of the sequences end with a different syllable, they might come to expect all sequences to end with a different syllable. And if that's the case when they hear te, 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 they're going to be surprised by the absence of that different syllable. And that surprise, we hope to measure as pupil dilation. And so this is what we saw. So this is the variation of the diameter of the pupil compared to a baseline that is taken here, that is just before the last syllable. Okay, those are the 4 syllables of a sequence. And what you can see in red here, is that you have larger pupil dilation in response to AAAA sequences than in response to AAAB sequences. That is, you have larger pupil dilation when there is no different syllable. And that suggests that infants were really expecting a final different syllable. That is, that they represented that sequences should end with a different syllable. And that, I believe, is evidence that infants are capable at least of computing the relation different in some way. And by the way, we replicated this result with a larger sample size. So as I was saying, at least same is represented, but I believe that also different might be represented, even though there clearly is an asymmetry between the representation of these 2 relations. So I'm ready to take some questions about this part, if there are any. Yes, please.
Oh, another great section, and I have a horrible feeling that the answer to the question is going to be wait for part 3. But obviously, there's lots of tricky issues about exactly what it means to be represented, and differs in format. I guess that's maybe the simplest question. I'm just always curious because I know infants have early number capabilities. is it possible that sometimes essentially same means two of the same type of shape or whatever it is that's being varied, right? Whereas different same would mean there's only one of the same type. Different would mean there's multiple of the same type. Do you think there's any possibility that some early number ability is playing a role here?
Yes, so that's definitely a problem in the first experiment I showed you in this one, because here, because same is really exactly the same. So what you see is a blue disk appearing, disappearing, and reappearing, right? So it's absolutely possible that here infants represent one blue disk, so one element versus two elements. So that's a possibility here. It's less of a possibility, well, here already because the color changes, but you could say whether it's shape that matters the most and color is less important, so that could still be one. I think it's not a possibility with syllables. So here the syllables, I think, you know, because they happen one after the other. I think when you hear da, there's no way you think the second da is the same thing as the, I mean, is the same element as the first da, right? So it's really two syllables that are the same. At least that's the way I see it. So that being said, there are two examples of the same kind, if you want. So that's a possibility, yes.
Yeah, well, okay, and another slightly different way perhaps of thinking about it is, let's take the Dada case, there's no change from the first to the second. So is it possible that what the infant is aware of, well, not even aware of, is reacting to, is the presence or absence of change between
well, yes. So yes, it's possible. So I think it's what's, if you want, is happening here, right? So basically here, what infants are they come to expect a change, and they're reacting. That's the curve in red, to the absence of change, right? But right. What change, but what change is change is really for me a representation of different, right? So
okay, well, this is where it starts to get very subtle, right? Because I mean, we know that the nervous system does not respond as intensely to a repetition as sort of, you get dampening in response to repetition, and presumably that can have some consequences elsewhere in the nervous system.
Yes,
so but it doesn't seem to me that reacting to change or reacting to lack of a change necessarily implies what I would necessarily want to call representation.
Well, so it's subtle. I'm not saying that just reacting to change is having a representation of different, right? That's not the case. But I think that coming to expect change, right? So learning that there has to be a change at some point. So I'm going to hear ba, 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 and now I know the last syllable can be anything but ba. So it has to be different from ba. That, I think, is having some kind of a representation of different. So what this experiment shows, in my view, is that, so infants here react to the absence of this change. That means that they expected the change, and that expectation of a change for me is a representation of different.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you except for the last part about, oh, and therefore there's a representation, right? I mean, this is super interesting because what it's basically showing, I think you could describe it as meta surprise. So there's surprise when the last thing changes, and the infant is apparently learning that to expect to be surprised. So now the absence of surprise is surprising. So they're expressing a meta surprise, which is certainly extremely sophisticated. I'm not arguing at all about that. But I still think, you know, it's tricky to sort of tie this to the kind of notions of abstract representation that ultimately feed into propositions and all that fancy stuff.
No,
But
absolutely.
anyhow.
So I agree. You could make that. You could interpret the data this way. What I think we agree on as well is that in any case, for same, I think we do show that infants can learn a rule that is predicated on same. So they can learn to choose same. They can learn to look right when there is same. Whereas for different, what we show might be slightly weaker in the sense that we show that they come to expect same, but we don't show that whatever that representation is can be the input of something else. So those two, in fact, those two representation might be a different type of different format, even maybe. I don't know.
Okay, thanks.
So,
Yes, Deidre?
hi. My comment is on, do you have clear evidence that same is an innately representative relation? I agree with your concerns about whether many studies, including the ones that Ferry and Hespos and I have done, I think are vulnerable to the claim that when an infant sees a series of different things and then dishabituates to same, this could mean, as we've argued, that they have formed the relation of different, generalize it across a sequence. It could also mean that they've just sort of seen pairs of objects and now they see something that they actually get, which is a same relation, and they look more at that. So it's a possible representation, it's a possible interpretation, but I think a more serious problem for the innate representation of same is the study that we did to replicate the rather primitive study that Turrell and his colleagues did, where we showed 7 to 9 month olds a pair of same things, and then we showed them the same pair again, and then we showed them 2 novel pairs, one same, one different, nothing, no at chance. When you show them the same pair again, they look more at the different pair. So they have not, at the very least, you have to say, whatever their innate representation is, if you take that view, it's not strong enough that they can recognize it when they see an example, even a 7 to 9 month old, even when they see that example twice. Whereas anytime you see a sequence of things, as in our studies and as in yours, it's at least possible that our account, which is babies aren't born the same, but they are born with powerful learning mechanisms like structural alignment that allow them to generalize across a sequence. And in many of your studies, which I think are incredibly clever, there are, I'm leaving apart I'm doing the look left, look right one, which I think is a clearer example. That's very cool, but I don't think you can rule out the argument that they've learned it. They've applied the same powerful learning processes to this regular sort of phenomenon.
Yeah. So first, I mean, I don't want to claim so far that those representations are innate. That's definitely an interesting question. I'm doubtful that they are learned during my experiment, because that seems like an awful lot to learn, in the sense that they already have to learn, what to do. So they would need first to learn the representation of the relation, and then to learn that representation predicts the output left or right. It's possible. I'm not saying that it's impossible. It just seems to me to be a lot, and to me it seems more likely that they already have that representation, or that capacity of representation, and that they display it in our task. But let's see what I'm going to talk about now, because it could be that in the end we agree more than we think on this issue. I think we agree on many things, but maybe on this issue. Let's see. Okay, so yeah, okay, so at this point, and I'm going to focus now only on SEM, really the little piece I have on different. That, and again, that's an other part of the asymmetries, that I think the evidence that there is a representation of SEM in infancy, from my point of view, is massive. I think there's lot of experiment, including also all the artificial intelligence, artificial grammar learning experiment a la Marcus, right? AAB, ABB, etc. All of these can be represented, suggest that there is a representation of same, and they don't need any representation of different. I think evidence that really shows a representation of different is much more tenuous. I would argue that my experiment shows that, but it's very limited at this point. Okay, so now, again, so I think at this point we are facing a paradox, right? Which is that, wait, where are we? Yeah, so data suggests that the relation match to sample is solved around 4 years of age and not before. So there's some kind of discontinuity here, but young children and young infants can represent the relation same. Now, the paradox is this, is that what does it mean that infants can represent the relation same? It means that somehow they see what's common to these pairs. They see what's common to AA, BB, CC, DD, etc. Right? But even though they see what's common there, they don't seem to be capable of matching two pairs. So they see what's common to BB and CC, but apparently they're not capable of matching BB to CC. So that's to me the paradox. And how can we solve this paradox? And so the intuition I have is that maybe there's a solution, a hypothesis at least, that can be drawn from the work that we've done on a match to sample task. But I mean, you don't really need an experiment for that. It's really just an intuition, but let me just show you the experiment because I like it. So it's a match to sample. So what we show here on the screen, we have cards that appear, okay? And the first two cards flip and they have symbols on them. Here you have a green cross and an orange circle. And the last card to flip is the central one. And this card can be the same either as the left one or as the right one. And then what happens is that the card that is the same as the middle one is animated. So here it starts looming. And what we see in this experiment is that infants, after a number of trials, begin to anticipate and to look at the correct side before the card starts looming. Now, how do they represent this? And one way I think to conceptualize this task is that basically they learn that if they see A in the center, they have to choose A. If they see B, they have to choose B. If they see C, they have to choose C. And they generalize this. So if I see whatever I see in the center, I have to choose. So if I see X, I have to choose X, whatever X is. So basically, one way to represent this is to introduce the notion of a variable. And so in a match to sample, I think what infants could be represented is really a rule that is predicated on a variable. That is, for X in a relevant domain, choose X, where X is a variable and its value is defined in every trial by the middle card, in this case, by the sample. Now, if you take this for granted, if you accept this idea that infants might have this capacity of representing a variable, then what's interesting is that you can build what I think is a representation of same from that variable. The idea is that two same elements could be represented as XX, right? For X in the relevant domain. And why is this format of representation interesting? I believe. I think it is because I think it can explain, it can solve the paradox that we had before. Why? So X is a variable, okay? So it can change its value over time, but it can be assigned only one value at a given time. So what does it mean? Because it can change over time, it means it can refer to A and then later to B. And because of that, XX can refer to AA, and next it can refer to BB, and then to CC, etc. And so that can explain how infants can habituate to series of same pairs. That's also how that accounts for their learning a response that is conditioned on XX. Right? So the idea is that they can have this representation of XX that is going to mean AA, then BB, CC, etc. But again, X can take only one value at a time. That means it cannot refer at the same time to A and to B, right? So XX cannot be used to match AA to BB because it cannot at the same time refer to AA and BB. And that I think can account for for the failure on the relation match to sample. I think this representation can also, this format, at least a representation, can also account for the asymmetry that we argued for between same and different. So again, if XX is a representation of same, you might think that maybe XY, so two variables, could be a representation of different, but it's not. It's not because if you put it this way, there's no constraint on the value of Y and on the value of X. And in particular, there's nothing that says that X and Y cannot have the same value. So XY, what XY is it's really a representation of two. XY says that there are two elements, but it doesn't say anything about the relation between these two elements. So what you would need in this format of representation to represent different is something more complex with some kind of, let's call it negation, or exclusion operator, or something that tells to the second element that it cannot have the same value as the first element. So that's what you will need here to represent the relation different. And that's definitely more complicated than XX. And that can account, I think, for the asymmetry. So XX, I think, can account for the data that we've seen so far. That is success in conditional same different tasks, success also in habituation task, failure in relational match to sample, and the asymmetry between same and different, that is different being more complex than same. Now, I want to argue that we can also make a prediction about this representation. So the observation here is that when you have XX, what you have really is one symbol for every entity in the relation, right? So XX means two same elements, but if you want to represent three same elements, we need XXX. Four same elements will be XXXX, etc. Okay, and of course, working memory is limited. So the idea is that there is, at some point, there's going to be a breakdown. At some point, your system should not be able to represent all these repetitions of X. And so what we can predict is that 2 same, 3 same, 4 same should be representable, but 5 same and 6 same should not. And this is what we're going to test. And I want to stress that this prediction about this constraint on number is really unique, I think, to the type of representation that relates in some way to same and different. So I've put a few here. All right, so if you consider entropy, for instance, entropy should work better with large arrays than with small arrays. Symmetry should work even with just one element. And of course, propositional representation, language-like representation, well, as soon as you have quantifiers, they don't have any restriction about the number. So this idea that the representation of same will be limited to small number is really specific, I think, to this type of representation. Okay, so how can we test this prediction? So this is the way we did it. So again, so it's again the pupillometry oddball paradigm, right? So Infancy, this little guy that is jumping, that's just to attract their attention. But they're going to hear sequences of syllables. And so here there will be, for every experiment, 2 groups of infants. The first group will be exposed to that kind of situation where most of the sequences have only identical syllables. So we will start with 4 syllables. So 75% of the trial will be composed of 4 identical syllables. So ba, 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 and then di, 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 then ko, 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 etc., etc. So syllables change every time. We use 48 different syllables. And then in 25% of trials, we're going to violate the rule, and they will hear something like lu, 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 me. So the idea is that if infants expect that the sequences respect the frequent rule, that is A, then they should be surprised by the last syllable, the last different syllable. So now, of course, there's another reason why infants might react to A, B, that is that you have a local change of syllable, right? You go from lu to me, from D to K, etc. So this is why we introduced a control group where here you have 50% of A sequences and 50% of A, B sequences. So this local effect due to the local change is the same in the two groups, right? So if the direction that we have is only due to this local change, we should have main effect and that's it. But if infants are capable of representing the structure here of the standard sequences, then we should see an interaction between the two groups. Okay, so that's the logic of this study. Okay, so I will first show on the first line, you will see the control groups. So here you can see that there's no particular dilation in response to AAAB sequences. But when the same sequences, so AAAA, are more frequent, then you see a reaction to AAB. So that suggests that infants, and we have an interaction between, so that's the difference between the two groups. And you can see that there is an interaction, and that shows that infants are capable of representing the structure of sequences of 4 same syllables. Okay. Now we do exactly the same thing, but instead of having sequences of 4 syllables, we now have sequences of 5 syllables. Okay, so again, this is the control group, no significant effect. And this is the say unbalanced group, and we have also no effect here. So that suggests that infants are not capable of representing 5 same. And when we move to 6 syllables, we have now an effect in the control group and also in the experimental group. And in fact, what we observe here is only a main effect. There's no interaction. And that suggests that here there's a reaction due to the local change. So after hearing so sorry, ba, 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 bi, then there is a reaction, but it's not due to the representation of the sequence, of the structure of the sequence that is defined by the relation same. Okay, so infants can represent 4 same, but not 5 same or 6 same. And now we asked whether they could represent the first 4 elements of a sequence of 6 syllables. Okay, so now what you can see here is that we change the 4th syllable instead of the last one in a sequence of 6 syllables. And again, now we see the interaction. So that suggests that infants can represent the 4 first same element of a sequence of 6 elements. Okay. So this experiment really validates the prediction that we made, that is that the representation of same here in infants, by the way, I haven't seen it, but those are 11 months old. So the representation of same that they use in this task, at least, seems to be limited to 4 and doesn't extend to 5 or 6. Now, of course, we never really expected infants to represent exactly 5 same or exactly 6 same, right? Because infants at this age do not have a representation of exactly 5 or exactly 6. So if they were to succeed, what they would have had to represent is something like all the same. And so this is also what so this time we wanted to verify that they don't represent all the same. And the way we did this is by changing modifying the number of syllables, right? So it varies between 3, 4, and 5, but once in a while, the final syllable is different. And again, here you don't see any pupil dilation. Okay, so I'm getting to the end here. That is what I want to argue with this experiment is that the relation same is built from the representation of individual entities. That is something like XX for 2 same elements or XXX for 3 same elements. And that also means, if that's the case, that there's no discrete symbol for the relation same. So what does it mean? So all of this work, in a way, is trying to place infants so to decide whether infants look more like baboons or chimps, at least when it comes to relational thinking, or whether they're already on the side of this gap and more like human adults. And I think all the data that we have so far, even though we haven't done direct comparisons with animals, but there's nothing that we've shown with infants here that I would not expect chimps or baboons, at least, to also be able to do. So I think infants really are behaving here like baboons. And what I think the representation of same is for infants, it's something like XX, that is the repetition or the copy of a variable. And again, as I argued, the XX can refer to duck, duck, and then later to cup, cup, etc., but it cannot refer at the same time to duck, duck, and to cup, cup. So that's an abstract representation because the variable X is abstract, right? But X is really a representation of the entity. So basically the idea is that here there is a representation of the relation same that is abstract, but it's abstract because it's built on an abstract representation of the entity. And importantly, there is no discrete symbol here for the relation same. That is, there's no representation of same of the relation that is dissociated from the representation of the entities. Now, the argument is that later on in development, maybe around 4 years of age, children and adults later have that kind of discrete symbol. They have this symbol S that is dissociated from the representation of the entities, and that is what is a propositional representation. And of course, once you have that kind of representation, well, the relation match to sample becomes much easier, right? Because now you have duck, duck, you match it to S, you have cup, cup, you match it to S, and now you can directly match S to S. The idea also is that once you have S, first of all, it provides full abstraction because it's completely dissociated now from the entities that it relates to, whereas XX is not. And once you have S, it can also combine with other symbol and operation. It can combine more easily with negation. You can get not same, which is different. You can also combine it with quantifier and represent something like all the same. Now, when is this happening? And so, as we discussed already in the first part of this talk, at this point, there's no definite evidence for that. But what is clear is that none of these things representing all the same, passing relation match to sample, etc., none of this is happening before children are something like 4 years of age. And that's a time where they've learned the word same. So that, I think, put the hypothesis on the table that this symbol S might be nothing else but the word same. And so it could be that this is really the work that the word same is doing, is giving you this discrete symbol for the relation that is now completely dissociated from the entities that it relates. And so to conclude on a broader view, I think the idea that I want to push here is that young infants really start their life as animals, and that it's only when they learn words that they start to build the bridge to cross the gap and become human. So I want to thank my collaborators and my funders, and I'm happy to discuss more if you have questions and criticism and comments. Thank you.